time, I'm going to invite Hale Tufan, who is going to facilitate the Re-orienting Crop Improvement to Prioritize Breeding for Developing Impact panel. Over to you, Hale.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. It's my privilege to facilitate this panel on reorienting crop improvement to prioritize breeding for development impact. The goal for the Global Food Security Strategy is to sustainably reduce hunger and malnutrition and poverty. At ILCI, we're building frameworks on how to approach crop improvement priority setting to center around this holistic vision for impact. How do we start with intended impact and work back to breeding priorities? Today, this panel will discuss the questions around how we conceptualize impact and how cross-cutting issues shape our crop improvement work. So I'll first start by introducing our panelists. We're very fortunate today to have a great group of panelists to reflect on this topic. Dr. Dee Rubin is the co-director of Cultural Practice, LLC. Dr. Rubin brings 30 years of experience working with key groups leading gender integration in the agricultural development and economic growth agenda, conducting gender assessments, evaluations, developing monitoring indicators, and overall supporting gender equality programming. Dr. Rubin shapes leading-edge approaches in achieving and measuring gender equality from her work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, IFAD, and IDRC. A leader in applying qualitative methods in development, she also works closely with IFPRI at the project level Women's Empowerment Agriculture Index, as well as other CGIAR centers on gender, agriculture, agribusiness, environment, and climate change issues. Dr. Roberto Camacho is a principal investigator for the Central American and Caribbean Crop Improvement Alliance, funded by ILCI. Dr. Camacho also coordinates the Integrated Rice Research and Extension Program for INTA Costa Rica. A rice breeder by training, Dr. Camacho has held roles as a rice breeder with INTA, as well as coordinating the grain program covering rice, beans, corn, and sorghum. Dr. Camacho received his bachelor's degree from agronomy at Earth University and his PhD in plant environmental management and soil sciences from Louisiana State University in 2017. Dr. Ranjita Puskur leads the research program on gender and livelihoods at the International Rice Research Institute, as well as the evidence module in the new CGIAR gender platform. She's been part of the CG since 2002, working with the International Water Management Institute, the International Livestock Research Institute, where she led research team working on innovating in livestock systems, and World Fish, where she led programs on gender and impact at scale. Her work focuses on generating knowledge, learning, and evidence that can translate into technical and institutional innovation and lead to more equitable outcomes for women and other vulnerable groups engaged in agriculture. Dr. Michael Chipeta is the principal investigator for the Center of Innovation for Crop Improvement for East and Southern Africa, also funded by ILCI. Dr. Chipeta is a lecturer at the Lilongwe University of Agriculture and Natural Resources in Malawi, and he holds a PhD in plant breeding from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Dr. Chipeta's cowbee breeding program focuses on selecting and developing high-yielding, disease-resistant, drought-tolerant, nutritionally rich, and stable varieties for improved food, income, climate resilience, and nutritional security in Malawi. Dr. Chipeta is a 2018 Norman E. Borlaug International Agricultural Science and Technology Fellow at the University of Tennessee, a Fellow of the African Science Leadership Program, and an affiliate of the African Academy of Sciences. Dr. Jesse Poland is an associate professor at Kansas State University and director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Applied Wheat Genomics, with a focus on applying genomics tools to accelerate wheat breeding and develop climate-resilient wheat varieties. As director of the Wheat Genetics Resources Center, Dr. Poland also leads research to characterize wild wheat germplasm and leveraging valuable genetic diversity for wheat improvement. Dr. Poland has been awarded over $25 million in competitive grant funding through NSF, Kansas-based organizations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, McKnight Foundation, USDA, and USAID. So with that introduction, we'll go straight to our questions. The first one is to all panelists, and I'll call your name directly as I ask these questions, and we'll have about a minute to answer each. Arguably, all crop improvement is for impact, but what matters is how impact is defined. So I'll ask each panelist to articulate, how do you define impact in relation to crop improvement goals? We'll start with Roberto, please.
Thank you, Holly. So good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone. It's such a wonderful honor to be here with you today. It's personal, but for me, impact should be measured by the way we improve the quality of people's life. Like, for example, how we help a farmer and his family to have a better nutrition or have food security, or a woman entrepreneur, like we were talking today about the seed business, to have a better income, and with that income to improve her house or different needs that she or her family can have. But I think one important thing to say is the path to is about the path to impact, because I asked one friend a long time ago. She's a very successful consultant, and he told me this: in order to have success with your varieties or technologies, whatever you propose first should address a problem and offer a valid solution. So whatever we develop should be a solution for a real problem, and this is the reason because this work on priority setting that ILCI has put so much emphasis on is really, really important. Thanks again for the opportunity, and that was my contribution.
Thank you, Roberto. Ranjita, please.
Thanks, Hale, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here to have this opportunity to share some thoughts. So, crop improvement goals, impact. I personally think women and men in smallholder farming households having access to the right varieties at the right time, which help them meet their goals of resilience or nutrition or high yields is what counts as impact for me. Recognizing that these goals might differ for different people, even within a single household. But what we need to bear in mind is that whether they achieve these higher order impacts of resilience or higher nutrition depends on a number of other factors, and not just the crop variety we provide. In the discussion so far, we've been talking about complementary technologies, but there's also a number of other factors that influence what happens after, or when these people get access to these varieties. I mean, it's commonplace. We hear this so many times. We say, hey, we've given, some of these women access to new varieties or good quality seed, and we claim we have empowered them. Empowerment is a very loaded term. That's an impact we see, but it depends on a number of factors, and most notably social factors. So we can facilitate empowerment, or we can try and create enabling conditions, but we can't say, hey, just because we've developed a great variety and provided them access, that's changed people's lives or, empowered women. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranjita. Michael, please.
Thank you, Hale, and also thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel. So to me, impact, I would define it as changing the lives of the people positively through plant breeding. So in this case, we're talking of the food security. People should have enough food on the table. Then we'll talk of impact. But also talking of the people having money in their pockets. That is, they produce enough food, they should be able to sell the extra and have income. That's income security. But also we define impact in terms of the nutritional issues. Because in sub-Saharan Africa, or maybe in developing countries, most of the people are malnourished. But if we develop a variety and is able to reduce the malnutrition status of the people, then we'll be talking of, say, plant breeding has got an impact. And recently with the issues of climate change, definitely, most of the farmers who are rain-fed dependent, in most cases, they don't harvest enough. But if I've got a variety that is able to withstand some of the climatic shocks, say drought, and the farmers are able to harvest enough, then in that way, we'll define to say that plant breeding has got really an impact. I submit, Hale.
Thank you so much, Michael. Dee, please.
Thank you, Hale, for organizing this multidisciplinary panel on crop improvement and development impact. It's a critical question, and I think so far everybody seems to be in pretty much agreement. So I hope that I can add to that. For me, the real impact is that last step of the agricultural research impact pathway, the one that usually is shown as a big box that has some labels in it like household well-being, increased income, and food security, and more recently, women's empowerment, as Ranjita has mentioned. But these impacts don't emerge without first having had the right questions in the research. As scientists, we are all drawn to the intellectual challenge of seeking an answer to a specific problem. That is, after all, where our incentives are and from which we earn our rewards. However, the questions that interest us may be fairly narrow in our disciplines. The impact pathway asks us to step back and to examine all the steps that need to be in place to achieve the impacts that benefit real people. Its success rests on the understanding of the needs of all farmers, women and men, youth and adult. But this does not mean that farmers are always right about everything that they need. Researchers may have great solutions that farmers are not aware of, but that they would benefit from, like climate smart agricultural varieties that will perform under our changing climatic conditions. So long as these new products are created in a partnership with the farmers, where there's a back and forth of the information, then there can be a real process of communicating about those potential benefits to those who will ultimately make the decision to adopt and to benefit with the various points that we have raised about income, well-being, and nutrition and food security. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dee. And last but not least, Jesse, please.
Thanks, Ali. So I think everyone summarized it beautifully. Michael really touched on the key points of food security and nutrition and, household income. And then Dee perfectly pointed out that last piece of, taking it the last mile. I think I would just add the one focus on the front end of that, on the crop improvement piece of that, and obviously with the breeding programs. But we talk a lot about sustainability and just thinking about how do we make the breeding programs per se, the breeding programs themselves sustainable, and thinking about what kind of feedback, both information and funding mechanisms need to happen so that these breeding programs are operating at a high level, and whatever the breeding target is, have such a program that can quickly and effectively address that. And so I think that's where we really make this sustainable long-term impact, by connecting it from connecting it from start to end, and then making the whole pipeline sustainable. Thanks.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you all for those opening thoughts. I'm going to move a little bit and change subjects slightly here. International crop improvement, and we've seen this throughout the last 2 days as well. We're talking a lot about market-led or demand-led breeding recently. Do you think a shift towards market orientation will help achieve greater impact from crop improvement? And what challenges do you think this brings? We're going to have 3 panelists respond, and I'll start with Ranjita, please.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Thanks, Hale. Yeah, interesting question. I'd like to think, the shift does enable us to have, bigger and more wider impacts, but it is not without challenges. I mean, it all depends on how we define or interpret what we mean by the market or demand. Whose demand are we talking about? Which markets are we talking about? I mean, I've seen a lot of bias when we talk about market or demand. People immediately jump to assume it is about the consumers of these grains or products or whatever in a lot of these efforts. I mean, it is true that farmers do respond to these consumer demands or market demands, and this may be a legitimate way to think. But we also have to realize that not all farmers are producing for the market. There are millions of subsistence farming households. So when they are the market, what kind of varieties do we develop to meet their household objectives? When they are producing for the market, to sell most of their produce, what are the kinds of requirements they have in terms of varieties they'd like to see? And also, it isn't just about farmers or the consumers. I mean, there's a broad range of stakeholders in the value chains when we talk about these markets or demand. And we also know that the power relations are quite asymmetric across these value chains. There are some very powerful actors. Information doesn't flow as freely as it should. So, I mean, I've seen examples in Asia where it's in rice value chains, it's the millers who call the shots. So the small farmers who produce a little bit for the market or sell a part of their produce have to respond to these millers' demands, because otherwise they are not able to sell their crop. I don't think we have an adequate understanding of how the information and demand gets transmitted through these value chains. How does it shape the demand for varieties or crop improvement products ultimately? So we have some ways to go in terms of unpacking that. So I think being able to define the target group sharply and the impact we are seeking, we all talked about our interpretations or what we think impact should be when we were responding to your previous question. So defining that impact for that particular target group, and as Dee said, defining those outcome and impact pathways and understanding the value chain dynamics, I think are very, very critical to make these approaches work and have that bigger impact that we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ranjita. We'll go back to Jesse, please.
Great, thanks. I think Ranjita had a perfect introduction for this on like properly defining what we mean by the market or the demand, and whether that's a farmer or a consumer or whoever it be. So I would add the breeding perspective again on the front end of this, in that the context is that plant breeding and selection is a phenomenal enterprise, to where if you have the right selection and the right screening tools and the right target, you can drive plant populations to almost any amazing combination of traits. And so the critical piece that's so important, and this is where adding this market orientation and the breeding is so critical, is that now you can drive the breeding populations towards whatever target that is. And Ranjita also mentioned this feedback mechanism, and that's where I'm going to focus, is so critical, because you sort of have, so if you think about the plant breeders putting out new varieties, and this going to seed producers and seed system, that goes to growers, and then that goes to maybe end users or the growers themselves, or whoever's the final consumer of this. You have this mechanism, but it needs a critical feedback, whether it's an information feedback or some economic driver feedback. And so anytime that kind of connection starts to break down, and I've seen it break down right in Kansas wheat breeding, I've seen it break down in the developing world, wherever you want to talk, anytime that feedback and those mechanisms start to break down, and then you risk that these breeding targets and the breeding program starts going off in the wrong direction. So that's the real challenge that I think. So absolutely getting this market focus is really critical. And then the big challenge is figuring out what are the mechanisms and making sure they're in place, whether it's a financial, right, playing a premium for a certain variety that the seed producers will then demand these kind of traits that the breeding program will then deliver. and things like this. But getting those mechanisms in place and making sure they're effectively and basically communicating correctly from the breeding program all the way to the end user is really critical to make sure that the breeding program can definitely do it, but to make sure they're getting the right signals.
Thank you, Jesse. And we'll round off with Michael, please.
Thank you, Hale. Can you allow me to proceed without the video? My connection is not good.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I think my two colleagues have clearly highlighted the likely impact that demand-led breeding would bring. But let me begin by acknowledging that adoption of the improved varieties is one of the major challenges that we face as plant breeders. For example, in Malawi, we're working on cowpea, and you find that only 10% of the farmers that are using improved varieties. And we have come to realize that some of the issues that lead to these low adoption levels is that our current breeding programs are not really focusing much on what the different stakeholders want in a variety. For example, issues of grain size, grain color, and also issues of cooking time, which are quite pertinent to women farmers. So we realize that also we have paid also much attention focusing on the production challenges such as yield, pest, and the disease resistance. So to directly respond to your question, whether a shift towards the market orientation would help achieve greater impact, in simple words, I would say yes, it would help achieve greater impact because ideally, the demand-led plant breeding should translate to improved variety uptake by the farmers. So what it means is that more farmers are growing that variety, and in terms of the consumers, more people are using that variety. If you talk of the processors, more of the processing companies are using those varieties. So by the end of it, you would expect that there will be an improved production level amongst the farmers. And also, since more people are adopting the varieties, you expect that they'll have access to nutritious diets because the food or the varieties that have got the requisite nutrients is available on the market. But also, it would also entail that farmers will have money in their pockets because the variety that has been released is in response to the demand that is on the market. So what it means is that farmers, they grow and they produce a particular crop and they use the other for consumption, but they will have other extra to sell it on the market. So they will have extra income. So in that way, we're achieving some of the impacts that you would anticipate in terms of the food security. So let me go to the second part of the question to say what could be the expected challenges. Actually, I foresee three challenges emanating from the demand-led breeding approach. The first one is, as Jesse has already mentioned, I think the cost of developing the market-preferred varieties would likely go up because in here now we are bringing different stakeholders in the breeding pipeline to give in their inputs. So those consultations with the different stakeholders, they need resources. So the cost of producing that particular variety would be high. The second thing related to this is that since now we're investing more in the variety development, what it means is that very likely the cost of buying that variety on the market will be high because we invested more and now we wouldn't sell it at a lower price. It means the price for that variety will go up. The end result is that most farmers, more especially in developing countries, will not be able to purchase that variety. So we may end up going back to the same situation where we've got low adoption levels because the breeders would also want to cap on the investment that they made. And the last one, I feel with the demand-led breeding, one of the challenges is that we may have a never-ending cycle of variety development because of the dynamism in the markets due to the changes in the preferences. Say, for example, after 5 to 8 years, you are in the pipeline of developing a variety. After 5 or 8 years, you find that the preferences have changed. You need to adjust as well to the needs of the market. So you may end up with a cycle that is not being completed. And the end result is that you may not reach, you may fail to reach the targets, and the varieties may not be on the market. So that's what I think in terms of the expected impact, as well as the challenges that we foresee with this approach of demand-led breeding. Thank you, Hale.
Thank you all. That was a great discussion spanning from how to design intentionally, but how to breed and the implications of that shift in breeding. So thank you for those perspectives. We're going to move on to our next question. Addressing cross-cutting issues, youth, gender, nutrition, and resilience undoubtedly enables positive impact from our work. So I'd like to turn to the panelists, two panelists in particular, and ask them to reflect on how has research on cross-cutting issues influenced the way you understand impact of crop improvement, and provide an example to substantiate. We'll start with Dee, please.
Okay, I was just checking about being muted since I always make that mistake. This was a great question, but a little difficult for me to answer because so much of my research has been on cross-cutting issues and has been involved with crop development as well. So when I thought about it, it took me back to my research as a postdoc, which was a while ago. And I was working with the International Center for Insect Physiology and Ecology in Kenya. I was only one of 2 social scientists who were part of the institution at that time. And we had formed a unit that we called the Social Science Interface Unit. And it was always difficult to say that. It sounded like interfaith unit, but which in some ways was not so far off base, given the difference in perspective of the social scientists and the other scientists. But our purpose with the interface unit was to work with the agronomists, the entomologists, and the biologists, and to encourage them to think about the farmers that they worked with as much as they thought about the plants and the bugs. And in many ways, this experience really shaped the way that I have thought about development throughout my career and my commitment to what we're now calling these cross-cutting issues on gender, youth, nutrition, and resilience. I was at the time carrying out research kind of as a side project on the intercropping of maize and beans to determine whether intercropping had any impact on the level of pest infection on the plots. And it turns out it did, that by intercropping, you confuse the bugs about which crops they're going to be attracted to. At the time, clear weeding of maize plots, taking out all the maize, was the recommended practice. So anything that interfered with weed clearing, including intercropping, was really a strong no-no. However, interviews with women who were responsible for weeding, not only on the test plots, but also on their own maize and beans fields, identified a serious obstacle to doing clear weeding. One of the weeds that was found on the plots turned out to be a local vegetable, and it was often collected and it formed an important part of the evening meal. So the practice of clear weeding meant that families would be losing a volunteer crop, the weeds, on which they were relying to supply both nutrition and calories to the household. It was a very simple but powerful observation about the importance of needing to understand the farmer's objectives in order to ensure that recommendations that were being made by the crop scientists, or in this case, the insect scientists, were actually going to have value for them. And I've really never forgotten that, obviously, that I can call on it now. And I feel it's an important point to pursue in our work under ILCI, to think about these kinds of perspectives, but to also recognize that it takes a lot of time to get to the point where people will provide that information. And that's something that we often forget. So one of the influences of this, or not influences, but the consequences of this research is really to remind people that developing these qualitative protocols and asking the right questions in surveys needs both time and funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Dee. And secondly, Roberto, please.
Well, thanks again for the opportunity to give my opinion about it. I would like to touch on two different cross-cutting issues. The first is youth, and the other is environmental resilience. First, youth is just is not really a research experience, but a life experience. About 10 years ago, I was a student in high school. I do not come from a family of farmers. I do not come from a family of agronomists or plant breeders. But at that time, I was given the opportunity to participate in different workshops from that was organized in my area of origin, and I cannot give you enough words to explain how much impact that had in my future path toward agronomy and toward finally plant breeding. So at INTA, we have a program where we get high school students involved in our research and technology transfer activities. And that is something that we really want to improve, to expand within the project, within CASIA, because not only our farmers here are aging, but also our agronomists, and people are less and less involved in agriculture. And again, we need to find ways to revert that. And just like me, and just like others that work with me here in Costa Rica and in Haiti, of course, we need to get them involved. We need to get them interested, the youth interested in these research processes. And the other is environmental resilience. We are going to work with common beans. Common beans are really important here in Costa Rica and Central America and the Caribbean for nutrition, staple food for us. Common beans are from mid-altitude forests, rainforests. They did not evolve to be grown on open lands. And with the current situation that we are experiencing here, with the higher temperatures, with more frequent dry spells, with more frequent droughts, that's really becoming an issue for us here. And through the research that our bean breeders, Nestor Chavez and Juan Carlos Hernandez, has done in Costa Rica, they have already identified that. I mean, breeding for drought resistance and for heat tolerant resistance as a priority. So that's something that it has been identified already across the globe as an important topic to direct our research objectives. But here in Costa Rica, here with our farmers, we are already experiencing it. And for us, it's a major deal, it's a major topic, a major need that we need to work with. So that's basically my two starting points to continue the conversation. And thanks again for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Roberto. We have a few minutes here. We can, if any of the other panelists want to take one of these two questions, if you didn't have an opportunity, feel free to do so now, and then we'll go to questions for the audience. So do any of the panelists want to address one of the other questions? Please go ahead. Go ahead, please, Roberto.
I would like to add something about the previous one, about the market demand-driven research. Here in Costa Rica, for some crops, we have like a different situation where the seed industry has already expanded, and the seed industry has already established some research work, like for developing, variety, or testing some materials that are imported. So I think that when a program or when a crop in a certain country reaches that stage, it's really interesting because the situation changes. And for us as breeders and for us as researchers, it becomes more like a public relationship, to work with them, to make sure that they still think that our work is valid, is important, and that we have their trust to continue a partnership for the long term. So that's something that we experience here with other crops, and I wanted to share with you because it's not exactly for sorghum, not exactly for common beans, but for other crops here in Costa Rica, it's a situation that we have to deal with. So that's my contribution.
Thank you, Roberto. Any closing? We'll have some closing thoughts, but any other contributions to those two questions? And any questions from the audience? Oh, Michael, go ahead, please.
Yes, I want to contribute on the last point to say, has research on cross-cutting issues influenced the way you understand the impact of crop improvement? Generally, I would say yes, because now, as breeders, we are able to isolate which traits to focus on so that we address the needs of the different sectors, say the youth, and also issues of the gender, nutrition, and the resilience. For example, in our past breeding programs, basically, we focused on yield, pest, and disease resistance. But now with the cross-cutting research, we are able now to move on and focus on other traits which address the cross-cutting issues like the youth, gender, and the resilience. So indeed, it's shaping the way we design our breeding programs, because now we're becoming more broader, focusing on a wider audience with the whole aim of achieving greater impact, because we realize that different social groups, they use these varieties. So if we are limited in our scope, definitely we wouldn't achieve greater impact. But now the research on cross-cutting issues indeed has opened up on the way we approach the breeding issues. So that's my contribution.
Thank you, Michael. And Ranjita, did you have addition?
Thanks, Hale. Just reflecting on, some of my experiences working on gender and women and breeding. We often tend to talk about social groups, women, men, youth, as if they are a homogeneous group. But there are several intersectional factors that come into play, which actually determine their access to some of these products. I mean, an example, working in India, where caste is a very important determinant of the identity of an individual, and that determines access to these resources very strongly. We worked for a long time on developing stress-tolerant varieties, and came up with some amazing products. The lowest socially marginalized groups, the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, as you call them in India, the ones with the really small holdings and who are subject to these stresses, droughts and floods and submergence year after year, and multiple stresses in the same year, actually need the most access to these varieties. But what we have seen is that these are the people who don't get that access. The government, the research agencies fail to reach them. It's the NGOs that are more effective at reaching these people. So I think it's really important to understand again, who is the target group? What are the impacts we are seeking? And therefore, how do we design those pathways to make that impact? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ranjita. In the interest of time, there's been questions in the chat box, so I just urge the panelists to go and check if there's anything to respond to there. And we'll have our closing thoughts from the panelists now. And as we're always looking to improve, as Angela mentioned, what last word from each panelist? What would you like to see ILCI doing in response to this discussion? Just one sentence, what positive change can we make in our work, reflecting on what we've talked about today? We'll go in reverse order from the opening statement. So I'll start with Jesse, please.
Okay, great, thanks. This is also responding to Joe's comment here. And I would just say that somehow developing these farmer, consumer, market-driven preferences, developing those into a selection tool that we can use in the breeding program. I think that's going to be really critical across the board.
Thank you, Jesse. Dee, please.
So from my perspective, I think all of the emphasis that we've heard about keeping the end in mind as we develop these strategies for the research is really important. And the most that I would like is to know that ILCI is continuing to support the importance of that, both in terms of the kind of emphasis that we give to the COIs, as well as the funding and the time to make sure that that happens.
Thank you, Dee. Michael, please.
Thank you, Hale. Let me commend LC for putting much emphasis on the cross-cutting issues. But just a point of caution is that we need to bear in mind that breeding alone cannot adequately address all the cross-cutting issues. And if you want to address all cross-cutting issues through breeding, I feel plant breeding will become more complicated because of the different vested interests of different social groups. But also, I would also to commend LC for also emphasizing on the market-oriented approach in plant breeding, because I think this is the only way that NARIs could make an impact, more especially on the smallholder farmers, whose oftentimes their views are not heard of, and breeders embark on a breeding program without necessarily getting the views of the stakeholders that are involved or that will be involved in the utilization of the different varieties. So that would be my final remarks.
Thank you, Michael. Ranjita, please.
Thanks, Hale. I think ILCI has made a fantastic start, a very thought through strategy, and you're working through it. And what I really appreciate is the learning element of it. You're constantly looking at what's working, what's not working, and always trying to get better at what you're doing. I think one of the most important things going forward is I think you've made a great start, but continue to invest in capacity development of these multidisciplinary teams, including a very strong impact orientation, and make sure a lot of all these efforts are front-loaded with a very good markets, economic, gender, and social analysis. I think that's very critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranjita. And to close, Roberto, please.
Thank you very much again. Well, I would like to first highlight the efforts from ILCI to make us work hard in this and on the cross-cutting issues. That is an important part of our proposal in CAISIA, and it's thanks to your guidance, and also thanks to the previous experience that we had on the issue. I was reading through the comments and also listening to the other panelists, and just we cannot underestimate the importance of participatory plant breeding and selection approaches. That's a permanent program, and it's one of the most efficient ways that we have for our experience, from our experience, have a constant, not only a baseline, but also a constant feedback from farmers and from other stakeholders as well. As we mentioned, millers, seed producers, and other stakeholders. So that's an important and final remark. Participatory plant breeding and selection approaches. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roberto. And thank you all for your time, for your preparation, for sharing your thoughts and experiences. It's been an absolute pleasure. I think this was a great panel. So I just want to thank you all again. And I'll transition to Steve and make a point that as we advocate for more time, more resources, more attention to these issues, that we'll try to reflect that as a management entity going forward. So we really are committed to continuing this work. Thank you again, Steve.